Using the word handicap comes with some baggage, which is appropriate because the word itself once meant the actual physical weighing down of racehorses to make them run slower. I'm not qualified to talk about what the word handicap means to the disability communities, but the word itself has a fascinating history. Besides having a surprising origin, the word has also more recently been used to describe the solution to a problem.
That problem was so difficult to solve that Charles Darwin said that the mere sight of it made him sick. This is Loops, a celebration of the interconnectivity of all things in history and science. Once the first edition of this book was published in 1859, the first 1,250 copies were moving so quickly that a second edition was published less than 2 months later with 3,000 copies. This was Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, his foundational work on evolutionary biology.
Darwin wrote to renowned botanist Asa Gray about the success, saying that, "No doubt the public has been shamefully imposed upon, for they bought the book thinking it would be nice, easy reading." In addition to the success, Darwin and Gray exchanged letters about the widespread criticism of his revolutionary theory. Many early critics brought up the eye as an example of a complex organ that couldn't evolve into existence. Darwin followed the explanation of Henri Milne Edwards, who proposed that complex organs like the eye evolve through increasingly specialized function, as opposed to forming de novo, in this case meaning with the end-state function intact from the beginning. If you imagine the eye evolving from a patch of sensory cells with gradual improvements to the directionality, detail, and focus, then an eye emerging from evolution becomes much more plausible and intuitive. Darwin remarked on this to Gray as well, feeling more satisfied with having a rebuttal to this criticism, but immediately describes a different criticism that he didn't have an explanation for. "It is curious that I remember well time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over. But I have gotten over this stage of the complaint, and now small trifling particulars of structure often make me very uncomfortable. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." Natural selection didn't intuitively explain why peacocks show such extravagant, beautiful, but cumbersome and costly plumage. In fact, a lot of phenomena in sexual selection has this same strange problem. Darwin's best stab at it was that choosy females slowly develop preferences for these traits over time in competitive males. That's not a thorough explanation on my part, but regardless, it's pretty unsatisfying. Enter the handicap principle. Imagine you're a female bird and you must choose between two suitors. This is a crucial choice for you, since unlike the males, you will be investing a lot of energy into making the eggs for your offspring. It's a bigger choice for you than it is for him, and therefore you're the one who needs to be picky. First, you see bachelor number 1, a regular-looking fellow, which isn't bad. From appearance sake alone, he could be the highest quality mate available. You don't see any visible disease or weakness, though they might be there. But you also don't see any waste. No extra bright plumage, no complicated song, no... Ooh, who's this? It looks like bachelor number 2 has arrived. Talk about waste. Look at those extra feathers. They are pretty, but how many more insects did he have to eat to earn those? How many more predators did he have to evade just to get here? Well, actually, he probably had to eat a fair amount more insects and evade more predators. Thinking about what you know about these potential two mates, the fact that bachelor number 2 made it to this moment at all, despite the handicap, actually does indicate that he's probably stronger and less disease-ridden than the average mate. Bachelor number 1 might also be, but you can't tell. If it came down to pure odds, bachelor number 2 is the right pick here. And that's not to say that all of this complicated decision-making went on in your mind. All you had to do was have a preference for those pretty feathers that were passed down by your predecessors who on average had the same successful preference. The core of the handicap principle is the proof that comes with the handicap that you're displaying. You might not be the fittest specimen possible for your species due to the handicap, but you have the proof that you need to show that your unseen traits are strong enough to support the handicap. Example of these handicaps can be features like courtship dances and bird songs, but they can also be signaling between species for non-reproductive purposes. Stotting is the behavior seen in four-legged prey animals, when they leap vertically into the air before evading a predator. The handicap principle explains this behavior as a signal of strength and agility to the predator. Another example would be the competitive altruism seen in Arabian babblers, who compete for the privilege of feeding other babblers. In fact, the evolutionary biologist credited with proposing the handicap principle, Amat Zahavi, did so in 1975 after studying the Arabian babbler. The concept wasn't embraced by everyone in the evolutionist community. John Maynard Smith, famous for his application of certain mathematics to evolutionary theory, was one of the handicap principle's loudest critics. The differences between the two scientists seem to stem from Maynard Smith's insistence on mathematical models, where Zahavi felt verbal models were sufficient. Maynard Smith's contributions to evolutionary biology were numerous and revolutionary, but he wasn't immune to controversy. He had a contentious relationship with another important evolutionary biologist, W.D. Hamilton, who believed that Maynard Smith had taken an idea of his relating to kin selection as his own. Hamilton's idea would later be known as Hamilton's Rule, and would only be similar to what Maynard Smith had published in New Scientist, but Maynard Smith would be later accused of fabricating a story about his mentor jotting the idea down on the back of an envelope. It's not reality TV level stuff, but it goes to show that even brilliant people aren't immune to drama. Maynard Smith's mentor was J.B.S. Haldane, yet another famous evolutionary biologist. Haldane is credited for merging the worlds of genetics and evolutionary theory using mathematical modeling. Believe it or not, in his day, these two fields didn't jibe with each other, but Haldane contributed to fixing that. He's also credited with being a prime contributor to early theories of abiogenesis, and was praised highly by the intellectual community. You can see this intelligence when reading his paper on abiogenesis, where he reasons from the knowledge of the time that bacteriophages must not be complete versions of life, but rather a cog in the life cycle of bacteria. He uses that to conclude the scale at which life could be generated, and then speculates on the chemistry which could achieve this. Pretty smart stuff, but none of this brilliance would save him from the backlash he would be facing for his political views. He was a vocal socialist, and was even accused by some of espionage. Peter Wright, an intelligence officer for MI5, would be the first to specifically accuse Haldane by name in his memoir/expose Spycatcher. Wright started his intelligence career as a researcher for the Macroni Company, a British radio company that specialized in wireless communications. After spending some time as an external scientific advisor for MI5, Wright was looped in on a problem that the Americans were dealing with in Moscow. The previous year, a British radio operator in Moscow heard the British air attaché when tuning his radio through Soviet Air Force frequencies. Not long after, the Americans discovered a similar problem hearing their own conversations on a Soviet frequency. They were able to discover the bug hidden inside the Great Seal of the United States, mounted behind the desk of the American ambassador to Russia. This seal was a gift to Ambassador Avril Harriman from the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization, a sort of Soviet youth scouting organization, like a co-ed Boy Scouts. Immediately, the Americans knew they were facing new technology. The bug was wireless and didn't require a battery. The mysterious nature of the device led quickly to its nickname, the Thing. Using what Wright called a howl round effect, today we call it feedback, kind of like what happens when a microphone picks up its own signal through a loudspeaker, the Americans were able to discover the device. When they tuned their generator to 1800 megahertz, they got the feedback that they were looking for, but they needed Wright's help to get it to work. Two Americans delivered the device to Wright in a wooden chess box wrapped in cotton wool. Wright was facing a tiny cylindrical microphone with a long antenna. Inside the microphone was a mushroom-shaped disc and a ruptured metal membrane. One of the Americans sheepishly admitted that their guys ruptured it when they were trying to figure out the device for themselves. After attempting to flood the device with 1800 megahertz like the Americans did, Wright was not seeing any signal in the transmission from the device. He then realized that the stimulating frequency and the transmission frequency would be different harmonics of the same series. This device is much more complicated than it looks, and there are differing reports about the details, but here's a simplified explanation. From the outside of the building, a stimulating signal is sent to the device to effectively power it. This signal is one of the harmonics of the antenna and drives the transmission of another harmonic. This transmission signal experiences amplitude modulation based on the resonant frequency of the microphone cavity. As sound vibrations act upon the metal diaphragm, the resonance of the microphone cavity offsets the transmission harmonic at varying degrees. This sends out a varied signal that at differing levels of sound stimulation contributes differing amplitudes to the transmission harmonic, and as a result broadcasts an AM signal of the sounds in the room. No wires needed, no battery needed, it's small, confounding, and simple. Surely the sort of brilliance needed to come up with this device isn't commonplace. The Soviet Union had a special design bureau called Sharashka, where they put scientists and engineers from their prisons and labor camps to work on special projects. It was here, sometime between 1938 and 1945, that Leon Theremin invented the thing. Theremin was sent there during Stalin's Great Purge, where supporters of Stalin's rivals were imprisoned. Theremin had just prior been in the United States, where he had a productive life and social success, and even a new star ballerina wife, Lavinia Williams. His escape from the US was scandalous at the time, with many thinking that he was kidnapped by the Soviets and maybe even murdered. However, the reason for his departure was largely unpaid federal taxes and other bills that were piling up. Before all that, though, Theremin was involved with designing radio watchmen, early 20th century equivalents of security alarms. He specialized in proximity sensors, which led him to invent the Terminvox in 1919, also known as the Theremin. The Theremin has a loop antenna for volume and a vertical antenna for pitch. The closer your hand is to the loop, the softer the instrument gets. And the closer your other hand is to the vertical antenna, the higher the pitch gets. Yeah, but how, right? That doesn't really explain how it works. We don't interact with any other electronics by moving closer and further away, right? Actually, we do. Nearly all touchscreens these days take advantage of a phenomenon known as capacitive coupling. They sense your touches by interacting with the natural capacitance of your body's ability to hold electrical charge. In the case of the Theremin, your body's capacitance combines with that of the capacitor in one of the Theremin's oscillators. LC oscillators, the kind you find in most Theremins, bounce charge back and forth between a capacitor and an inductor, giving them a resonating frequency. This frequency can be altered by the interaction with your body's capacitance. The closer you are to the antenna, the more capacitance you're contributing to the oscillator, and the lower the frequency of that oscillator. That oscillator is mixed with another one that is isolated from your body's capacitance and always produces the same frequency. This mixing produces a differential between the two oscillators, and that difference is the pitch that the Theremin plays. If you're far enough away from the Theremin, you don't contribute any capacitance, and the two oscillators resonate at the same frequency. The difference is zero, and your pitch isn't produced. Slowly come closer, and you'll raise the pitch. Say the differential is now 0.44 kilohertz, and now you're playing this note. The volume antenna operates in a similar way with its own oscillator, but it's not always mixed with another oscillator to control the volume. Theremin's instrument would not be used prominently in orchestral music, but it was used prominently in film scores starting in the mid-40s. The sound evokes spooky, strange, or sci-fi imagery, which is suitable for many movies produced in the second half of the 20th century. One of the film composers who had an appreciation for the Theremin was Elmer Bernstein, who used it in the Ten Commandments during the Passover sequence. Believe it or not, Bernstein also composed the film score for Ghostbusters. He didn't write the theme song for the movie, of course, that was Ray Parker Jr., but his love for the Theremin sound still shows in the film with the use of the onde martenot, a French keyboard instrument that synthesizes music like the Theremin does, but it allows the player to use a keyboard to produce the pitches and a left-hand panel to produce additional effects. Bernstein became a film score composer by writing music for American military propaganda films and the Armed Forces Radio during World War II. He would end up producing iconic film scores for several movies, including The Great Escape, The Three Amigos, To Kill a Mockingbird, Animal House, My Left Foot, and really just too many to list out. But like Haldane, Bernstein's life would be interrupted by his political beliefs. In the 1950s, a wave of anti-communist paranoia in the US led to large-scale accusations of treason and espionage. These accusations often occurred during hearings held by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Bernstein described the results of his appearance before the committee as preventing him from getting the kind of work he was used to from the big film studios. One of the primary complaints against Bernstein was that he regularly played recitals for a group called the Friends of the Soviet Union, but he points out that it was during World War II, and they were all allies at the time. Many similar stories appeared in the hearings and Hollywood blacklistings, and they all orbit around the generalized fear of communist ideologies fomenting in radio and television. But literature, even very old literature, was a target as well. In November 1953, the Indiana Textbook Commission focused their scrutiny on an Old English legend involving wealth redistribution, a notion that's suspiciously close to communist ideologies. Quickly, the thought of banning books which contain these tales, which were already firmly embedded in English and American cultures, was met with skepticism and ridicule. Ada White, the board member who had originally brought up the issue, received the majority of the backlash in print media. 5 students at Indiana University took the opportunity to form a sort of anti-communist movement that they called the Green Feather Movement. The movement grew, and despite being shut down by the university's administration, Blas de Villa, one of the original 5 students, credited the movement with generating further demonstrations. Those demonstrations, the Big Ten and the Joe Must Go movement, Joe being Senator Joseph McCarthy of McCarthyism, would eventually soften public support for the Hollywood blacklistings. And it was all thanks to a potential book ban that was a bridge too far for many. As early as the mid-1400s, that character who was robbing from the rich to give to the poor was Robin Hood. That mention of stealing from the rich to give to the poor first appeared, at least arguably, in a text called A Jest of Robin Hood. Compiled by an unknown poet, this text is the oldest complete tale of Robin Hood, though the main character's affinity for robbing with the premeditated goal of redistributing wealth is certainly not that old. In the jest version, Robin Hood's first gesture of charity comes when he gives a loan to a knight that he never ends up collecting on. It should be mentioned that originally Robin Hood's goal was to trick the knight into paying for a feast that they enjoyed together with Little John. Even in the jest version, there are several moments where Robin Hood offers charity to those who need it, but a more central characteristic of the hero is his willingness to be an outlaw. In that old version of the tale, he ends up beheading the Sheriff of Nottingham about halfway through the story. Scholars are certain that Robin Hood stories existed long before the jest version was compiled in the 15th century, but surviving stories of him from the ballads about his adventures aren't much older. In fact, the oldest surviving mention of Robin Hood, where historians are certain it's the Robin Hood, is in the 14th century English allegorical poem Piers Plowman. It's about a narrator who recalls a series of dreams, and in the dreams he encounters a variety of characters representative of different concepts, which are always named quite directly. Sloth, for example, one of the 7 sins, is a sluggish character who cannot recite the Lord's Prayer, presumably because he was too lazy to learn it, but offers instead some rhymes he does know, those of Robin Hood. He also offers up the rhymes of Randolph, Earl of Chester, but unlike Robin Hood's rhymes, those have been lost to history. Piers Plowman contains the oldest mention of a lot of things. Ragamuffin, for example, first appears in the text in reference to a demon, but a surprisingly clever bartering game first appears here too. In the poem, Gluttony is lured into a tavern where he does the unexpected, drinks a bunch of ale, takes a long piss, and passes out. But also during his time in the tavern, he becomes entangled in this trading game, where 2 of the tavern's patrons want to trade a cloak and a hood. A third party announces that the trade should be fair if the one offering the hood includes a cup of ale, and if either party disagrees, then gluttony gets a whole gallon of ale. So what's so clever about that? Well, besides being a great way to pressure gluttony into drinking more, the game that's being described is a method for trading two items of unequal value, which is really easier said than done. Let's say you have a cloak that you don't need any longer. What you need instead is a hood. Your friend Clem has a hood that he doesn't need any longer, but you can't just swap. You don't think that his hood is as valuable as your cloak, and you suspect that Clem probably agrees. You could start by saying that the difference is a quart of ale, or Clem could start by saying that it's just a sip of ale, but neither of you really know if your offers will be accepted, rejected, or insulting enough to end the trade. So here's a third party, your other friend Rob, who slaps a $5 bill on the table, and he suggests that if both you and Clem each put a $5 bill on the table as well, then he will decide what the difference in value is. He calls this extra money to facilitate the trade the forfeit money, and he calls the difference in value the boot. If what he decides is agreed upon, then the trade occurs and he gets to keep the $15 for naming an accurate boot. He also says that if both you and Clem think the trade is unfair, then he should still get the $15, since that's proof that the two of you wouldn't have come to an agreement anyway, and that the boot he named was still accurate. However, if just one of you, either you or Clem, thinks that it's a fair trade while the other one does not, then the person who would have made the trade gets to keep the $15, despite the trade not happening. Rob doesn't get the forfeit money because the boot wasn't accurate, but the one of you who doesn't think it's a fair trade also loses their money, since the traders are incentivized to come to an agreement. Basically, it will cost $5 to reject the trade. With this setup, all three parties are incentivized to come as close as possible to a common agreement. You have somewhere in your mind a minimum boot where you won't go any lower. Just like you, but kind of on the opposite side, Clem has a maximum boot. Rob, who isn't benefiting from the trade itself, wants the forfeit money, so he's trying to guess where the middle is. For him, it doesn't matter whether or not you and Clem's acceptable ranges overlap, as long as he accurately guesses the middle. For you and Clem, you're entering into a different gamble, betting that you do have an overlap, and knowing that Rob will do his best to find the sweet spot of a fair trade. We're nearly there, so let's review. The handicap principle was first described by evolutionary biologist Amat Zahavi and disputed by John Maynard Smith, the student of J.B.S. Haldane, who was accused of being a Soviet spy by Peter Wright, who discovered the secrets of the Thing, a Cold War listening device that was invented by Leon Theremin, who also invented the theremin, the musical instrument, the sound of which was used by Elmer Bernstein in many of his film scores. He was one of the victims of McCarthyism, a period of anti-communist fear in the United States, including a call to ban Robin Hood from Indiana school textbooks, the oldest surviving unambiguous mention of which appears in the medieval poem Piers Plowman, which is also where we find the oldest description of this hybrid gambling/bartering game. You may have noticed a crucial part of the game is that the decision of whether or not the transaction is fair must be made before both parties reveal their decisions simultaneously. It's kind of like rock, paper, scissors. There's a crucial moment that requires coordination to prevent either party from having an advantage. To solve for this, the game is often played with the forfeit money being held in someone's hat, where the traders each place one hand. With their hands in the hat, the third party states the boot. Then, at the same time, the traders pull their hands out of the hat, revealing their decision on whether or not the trade is agreeable. Sources differ about how the traders show this with their hands, and perhaps there were a variety of ways. One source suggests that bringing your hand out, grasping your forfeit money, is how you agree to the trade. Pulling out without the forfeit money that you had put in is the signal that you gave up your forfeit money and rejected the trade. This identifying feature of the game led to the name hand-in-cap, which over time smeared into the word handicap. It was later appropriated for horse races, where the faster horse was weighed down to make the horse's match better in the race. These were called handicap races, with the weight that was being applied to the horses being called the boot. The oldest surviving use of the word to describe impairment was in 1915. Until this time, it was always the contests that were described as handicapped and not the disadvantages themselves. Nearly all resources about disabilities agree that the usage of the term handicap to describe disability is outdated, including organizations like the ADA Knowledge Transition Center and the National Center on Disability and Journalism. They also agree that handicapable and differently abled are also out-of-date terms, and many think that these more recent alternatives were never acceptable. Dr. Ron Admonson from the University of Hawaii points out that a term's etymology doesn't need to be evil in order to justify the discouragement of its use. While the world moves on from the word handicap, perhaps looking at the histories of other words can bring us to more equitable and respectful terms to use when we describe each other.